There is a brutal truth nobody in your comfort bubble wants to hear. The world was not built to love you. It was built to test you, sort you, and crush what cannot adapt. And the part that hurts most is this. You already know it. You just keep refusing to name it. You call it stress. You call it trauma. You call it my healing journey. You post about it. You journal about it. You buy another course that promises a better version of you. But under all that polite language is the same question you're avoiding, because answering it would force you to change your behavior. When life burns you, what do you turn into? Today I want to talk about a kind of value that does not show up on a LinkedIn profile. Not charisma, not aesthetics, not the right friends, not the right brands, not the right excuses. I'm talking about a man's greatest asset, and honestly, it applies to anyone who has to carry responsibility: the ability to transform adversity instead of decorating it. Because adversity does not care how understood you feel, it does not care how many affirmations you repeat. It doesn't pause because you're having a difficult week. It comes anyway, and it asks one question again and again. Can you metabolize pain into action, or will pain metabolize you into dysfunction? Let's start by telling the truth about what you keep doing when you're hurt. You don't just suffer. You interpret, you narrate, you assign blame, you build an identity out of what happened to you, and then you use that identity like a shield against effort. I'm healing, I'm traumatized, I'm not ready, I need time. And you think you're being honest, but sometimes you're actually being dishonest in a more dangerous way. You're turning an injury into a role, and society quietly rewards that. That's the sick part. In 2026, we have infinite vocabulary for pain and almost zero training for turning pain into power. You can live stream your breakdown and get sympathy points. You can cry on camera and get followers. You can package your collapse as a personality and call it authenticity. But real transformation requires something less glamorous. It requires you to stop using pain as currency and start using it as fuel. Now, before you dismiss this as some macho motivational talk, listen carefully. I'm not praising suffering for the sake of suffering. I'm not saying be reckless. I'm not saying ignore your mental health. I'm saying the ability to convert adversity into discipline is not optional if you want a stable life. If you fail to convert adversity, you will convert it anyway into bitterness, avoidance, addictions, manipulation, and eventually a kind of self-betrayal that no amount of self-improvement content will undo. Adversity is not a rare visitor. It's the weather. Your job is not to pray it stops. Your job is to learn how to build a shelter and then learn how to walk in storms without losing your mind. That's where the first layer begins. One of the reasons people can't handle adversity is because they confuse comfort with safety. They believe that if their environment is smooth enough, they'll become strong enough. But strength is not grown in a spa. It's grown in friction. It's grown when you don't know what will happen next and you still move. It's grown when your plan fails and you choose to adapt instead of surrender. If you want to understand why this matters so deeply, look at the biological and historical wiring of the male organism. But I'll speak broadly enough for everyone. Males have historically been optimized for dealing with pressure, competition, danger, and conflict. That does not mean every man is automatically a warrior. It means the system is built with a tendency toward action under threat. The body prepares for fight or flight. That's ancient architecture, older than comfort culture, older than romance movies, older than the entire social media economy. So when modern life threatens you, your nervous system can either help you act or it can trap you in a loop. The difference is whether you convert fear into structure. If you convert fear into a plan, you function. If you convert fear into rumination, you corrode. If you convert shame into humility and learning, you evolve. If you convert shame into excuses and grievance, you rot. And here's what people hide from themselves. Many people don't actually fear hardship. They fear losing the image they've built. They fear being seen as incompetent. They fear being seen as replaceable. They fear that if they can't perform, their value disappears. So they avoid adversity by performing wellness. They avoid adversity by seeking signals from the outside instead of building capacity from the inside. They wait for the perfect mood, the perfect partner, the perfect timing, the perfect emotional readiness. They want life to pause until they feel safe. But adversity is not a teacher who waits for your curriculum. Adversity is a teacher that throws you into the exam room and watches whether you can think while terrified. That's why the people who truly have an unlimited future don't look unlimited. They don't look like they're always thriving. Their advantage is invisible. It shows up later, when everyone else is still collapsing. The second layer is historical, not as fantasy, but as evidence. Human beings have always lived inside brutal conditions. Some men survived because they turned pain into strategy. Some men died because they turned pain into paralysis. That pattern repeats across centuries because the psychological mechanism is the same. Think about what happens when a boy loses power, status, and safety. He can either become more competent or he becomes more toxic. In many historical cases, survival depended on doing something extremely hard, refusing to interpret humiliation as an identity, refusing to become a permanent victim. Imagine a child abandoned by his own people. Imagine the physical deprivation, the hunger, the humiliation, the loss of belonging. In a modern setting, you'd call that trauma. You'd talk about it with seriousness, and you should. But the real fork in the road is what comes after the trauma. Do you turn it into an eternal story where nobody treated me fairly becomes your excuse to avoid growth? Or do you turn it into a weaponized lesson about reality? There were leaders who were born into disgrace and still built empires, not because they were magically positive, but because they turned adversity into an internal mandate. They stopped negotiating with fate. They stopped asking the universe for permission to become better. They decided the only thing that mattered was capability. And this is where the third layer gets uncomfortable. Because most of you reading this have a private addiction. You want to be seen as good, but you don't want to be responsible for your outcomes. You want comfort, but you don't want to earn discipline. You want love, but you don't want to carry the burden that love demands. So you seek a relationship like it's an emotional subscription service. You want someone to regulate your anxiety, to reassure you, to rescue you from your insecurity. And when they can't do it perfectly, you interpret it as betrayal instead of limitation. Here's how this plays out in real modern life. A man loses his job, or his business stalls, or his investments collapse, or his family goes through a crisis, and you watch him. Does he become lighter, calmer, more rational? Or does he become a black cloud that steals everyone else's oxygen? The weak response is not just feeling bad. Weakness is turning the burden outward. Weakness is turning pain into complaint, turning panic into blame, turning fear into disrespect. Weakness is taking your internal chaos and dumping it on the person who has to survive with you. In a stable partnership, there is an agreement you rarely talk about out loud. The agreement is psychological. When the world attacks one person's capacity, the other person needs to feel that the foundation is still standing. That's what people mean when they say he is a pillar. They don't mean he never cries. They mean he doesn't collapse into uselessness. A man who only looks strong when life is easy is not strong. He's just lucky. He's just conditioned by comfort. True strength appears when nobody is applauding you, and the outcome might still be ugly. Now let's say the quiet part out loud. Many men are afraid to become responsible because responsibility strips them of their romantic fantasies. Responsibility means you can't just feel. You have to build, you have to act, you have to do boring tasks, you have to manage risk, you have to take feedback without spiraling. Responsibility also means you can't blame the past forever. At some point, your childhood stops being an excuse and starts being a diagnosis. You can use it to understand yourself. You cannot use it forever to avoid changing. So here's a question you're going to hate, but it's the key. When your life gets worse, do you get more disciplined or do you get more dramatic? Because dramatic suffering is addictive. It gives you attention. It gives you justification. It gives you the temporary relief of being the wounded one. It also keeps you from doing the work because the work would require you to risk embarrassment. It would require you to try again, fail again, and keep going without a guarantee. A lot of modern healing culture gives people permission to stay in that dramatic space. It tells them pain is sacred and therefore effort is optional. It tells them that if they feel something, that feeling is truth. It tells them that compassion is staying comfortable inside their victim identity. But compassion without accountability is just a slow form of self-harm. I want to go deeper with a psychological mechanism that people rarely name. The problem is not that you feel pain. The problem is what your mind does with pain. Pain naturally demands interpretation. Your brain wants meaning. So if you don't provide meaning that leads to action, it will pick meaning that leads to self-protection. Self-protection often looks like grievance. It looks like denial of your own agency. It looks like this happened to me, so I am entitled to stop trying. It looks like society is unfair, and therefore you refuse to play your part in building a life. This is the trap. You can be sincere and still be wrong. You can genuinely suffer and still misuse the suffering to sabotage your future. Some people will say, I can't do that. I have trauma. I'm healing. Fine. Then prove it. Show me consistent behavior changes that cost you something. Show me you handle disappointment without turning it into manipulation. Show me you can tell the truth without threatening someone. Show me you can plan without dramatizing your lack of control. If healing never touches your behavior, it's not healing, it's decoration. Now I'm going to talk about a specific type of adversity conversion that separates men with future from men trapped in coping. There is a difference between processing pain and using pain as an excuse. Processing pain means you analyze it and extract what you can. Using pain as an excuse means you protect your ego from effort. Here's a practical example, and it's not motivational, it's clinical. Imagine a man whose company collapses. He loses assets, he loses trust. In his mind, he can frame it as a random tragedy with no personal involvement, or he can frame it as data. That's the fork. If he's weak, he turns the failure into a story that makes him look wise and makes everyone else look cruel. He tells his partner, his friends, his followers that he was unlucky. He says the market is brutal. He says partners are incompetent. He says he tried his best. And then he stops doing the next necessary thing. If he's strong, he turns the failure into a system lesson. He says, what did I do wrong? What did the process fail to catch? What did I ignore because I was overconfident or underprepared? He doesn't obsess endlessly on emotions. He doesn't pretend emotions don't exist. He uses them as signal, then returns to analysis. Notice how both men suffer. Both have reasons to feel angry, but only one of them converts adversity into capability. Only one becomes safer for others. This is also why some women lose respect for men who crumble. Not because women are shallow, because respect is earned through reliability, and reliability is proven under pressure. A woman can forgive a man for being imperfect. She struggles to forgive a man for refusing responsibility. When a man turns crisis into chaos, he forces his partner to become the adult, and that quietly kills attraction. Not romantic attraction only, but respect itself, which is the soil where lasting love grows. So if you want to know why certain relationships die, don't blame lack of communication. Many times the real issue is that one person is emotionally outsourcing survival, and the other person eventually realizes they're being used. Now we move to the fourth layer, the modern epidemic of softened men. We're living in an era where comfort is everywhere, and struggle is optional. You can order food without leaving. You can vent online without consequences. You can get entertainment instantly. You can find a community of people who agree with your grievances in seconds. You can buy dopamine on demand. And when hardship arrives, you don't have a muscle for it. That's not your fault exactly. It's your environment. It's the design of your daily life. But environment doesn't remove the responsibility to build capacity. So you get men who are fragile, not physically only, emotionally. A small criticism from a boss can trigger a week of depression. A failed startup can trigger a retreat into dependency. A breakup can trigger spirals that look like mourning but function like avoidance. The man doesn't rebuild. He performs sadness and waits for someone to save him from his own uncertainty. And then he calls it sensitivity. He calls it healing. He calls it being human. But underneath, it's often just fear of discomfort, fear of the grind, fear of rejection, fear that effort won't guarantee success, fear that he might have to become someone new without knowing whether he'll get applause. This is where the healing trend becomes a sedative. It can become a beautiful distraction from the real job, which is to train your response to stress. You can sit and talk about wounds forever and never become more capable. You can feel pain without turning it into skill. You can expand vocabulary and shrink action. So here's the hard truth. You cannot heal a wound by watching it bleed. You heal it by moving through it. You heal it by doing what your nervous system hates. You train exposure to discomfort. You build tolerance until your mind stops treating pain as an emergency. There's a concept that matters here: pressure inoculation. You gradually train yourself to handle uncomfortable situations, not by romanticizing suffering, but by making discomfort familiar and manageable. Your body learns that fear does not equal danger. Your mind learns that you can survive the feeling and still act. In practical terms, this means you stop using comfort as a babysitter. You stop letting your mood decide your schedule. You stop waiting for energy that never arrives. You do the hard task even when you feel stupid. You lift heavier even when your muscles shake. You practice the skill even when you embarrass yourself at first. That's not about self-improvement fantasies. That's about strengthening your internal command system. Because if you cannot handle discomfort in a controlled space, you will fail when real adversity hits. And it will hit. It always hits. Now I want to connect this to identity. Most men don't just want comfort. They want identity stability. They want the story of who they are to remain unthreatened. So when adversity appears, it threatens the story. If your identity is "I'm a good person," then failure becomes shame, and shame becomes anger. If your identity is "I'm a victim of unfairness," then every problem confirms your identity and you stop trying. If your identity is "I'm sensitive and therefore others must adapt to me," then responsibility becomes humiliation. Strength requires a different identity. It requires you to become the kind of person who expects setbacks and still acts. It requires you to treat hardship like training rather than punishment. It requires you to believe that the meaning is not given by life but created by you. That's the hidden self turning point. When adversity comes, the hidden self tries to bargain. It says, "We can avoid this if we blame the world." It says, "We can stay small if we call it growth." It says, "We can stay stuck if we call it healing." And the more you believe these bargains, the more your life shrinks. So how do you stop being a negotiator with your own excuses? You use a process. A simple process